Also ich kann nicht sehr gut Deutsch sprechen, aber wenn ich von England gekommen, ich möchte sagen etwas, wenn ich mit dem Brexit sehr schwer habe ich gefunden. Und ich mag nicht die Idee, dass ich muss in Englisch sprechen, aber jetzt können Sie sehen, dass ich muss in Englisch sprechen. Aber ja, Entschuldigung von dem Brexit, das ist die erste Ding. So now, over to English. And I guess that in some way, this Brexit question is to do with how we understand togetherness, or what it is to have things together at the same time. And the way that I've been thinking about the relationship between sound art and music is very much about the problem, if you like, of how one might understand any kind of togetherness between sound art and music. And I've written, I've got my text here written down, which I will read, because otherwise I won't remember what I mean to say. But I thought, before I begin reading it, I just say what I have in mind in the clearest possible way, because it might actually be clearer if I'm not reading from my notes. So basically, today I just wanted to make two main points. So there are two areas that I've been interested in for the last 4 or 5 years, to do with this togetherness between sound art and music. And one of them is to do with this word mimesis. So mimesis is usually understood as the way that something is represented. So rather than being an authentic piece of a material in its own right, it's representing something else. So the material is a representation of something else. So in landscape painting, it would be that the painting is mimetically showing what the landscape looks like. So the relationship between the painting and the landscape is mimetic. So the painting is showing the landscape. And of course that happens with sound art in lots of ways, because you can make recordings and the outside world, the sounds that you can hear and the sounds that you can be immersed in, are kind of brought in to this recording. So it's making some kind of mimetic representation of this outside world. So that's one side of things in mimesis, but I'm also trying to bring another kind of mimesis into this togetherness, which is one that I feel comes very strongly from music. And that's the way that one person reacts to another person. So the mimesis that happens between people is something that somehow kind of often gets overlooked when one's talking about sound art and music. So the thing is actually that people respond to each other very directly, and one person is changed by the way that another person is behaving, and that feeds back to the person in the first place. So that's a kind of mimesis, but I call that reciprocal mimesis. So you're changing each other, we're changing each other simply by being together in some way. And my question is, in what way is that different from the way that we represent an environment through sound? And at first glance, one might say that the difference is that the environment doesn't respond back to us. So if you do a painting of a landscape, the landscape doesn't look at it and say, oh, I should look more like that, or, oh yes, I'm going to become a bit more, green or yellow or something like that. So it's not reciprocal in quite the same way. Maybe it should be, but it feels different from the way that one person responds to another. So that's one of the ideas that I'll be talking about. So this thing of these two kinds of mimesis. One grounded in the outside world, and the other reflects it between people. And the other thing that I'll talk about a bit is something that I've become quite fascinated by, which is that in the hard questions about sort of musical structure and composition and what we actually think structure might be in that kind of scenario, there's a very tricky ground. And the thing that I want to talk about is this relationship between hierarchy and equality inside musical measurement. So I'd be happy to be enlightened more about this and contradicted, but it seems to me that in musical structuring of sound, one of the things that is really interesting is this relationship between the hierarchical relationships and relationships of equality. And those questions of hierarchy and equality are political as well, but we can feel them in the working with musical material. So it feels like possibly a sort of essentialism to say that there are these things in musical material. That's why it's problematic, but I'll talk about it a bit more. So, those are the two things, mimesis and musical measurement. And now I'll disappear into my text and hope to stay with you. Before I do that, I should just say that some of these ideas came out of the colloquium and this book that's coming out later this month, at which the Honourable Volkmar Kien was present and was made really, really interesting contributions, which we've been reflecting on as well. So Volkmar is part of this as well. So, reciprocal mimesis and grounded mimesis. The interaction between musicians has been one of the traditional strengths of music. It includes an audience and ritual participants, but has its origins in group activity, the interpersonal responses of one musician to another. Sound art, on the other hand, can give validity to types of hearing that do not originate in deliberate collective action, for example, in soundscape or acousmatic listening. Neither of these positions is absolute, and in this talk I want to explore a series of links between them, which turn on the symmetries and correspondences between two specially coined terms, so these are the ones that I mentioned earlier, of reciprocal mimesis and grounded mimesis, where reciprocal mimesis is linked to notions of mutual entrainment. So entrainment is the thing of how people start blinking at the same speed, or breathing at the same rate, or walking at the same speed without even thinking about it. It's a very strong unconscious trait. So the mutual entrainment between people singing and playing together is an incredibly strong thing. The other kind of mimesis I'm going to call grounded mimesis, and it links to the representation of the non-musical audio environment and sound objects within that environment. And these two terms are not proposed in order to establish fixed entities, but are intended to function as temporary placeholders, allowing for a development of a range of interrelated ideas, which I will elaborate on. So I'll just define the terms a bit more clearly, first of all. So reciprocal mimesis can be understood as an extension of entrainment, and it's a significant thing in negotiating the sonic relationship between musicians. And it's discussed by researchers from a lot of other backgrounds as well, for example, ethnomusicology and biomusicology. And entrainment, this mutual reaction to each other can be described as the way in which two or more people attune to each other using patterns of behaviour simultaneously reflecting and internalising the other in a reciprocal construct. The feature that distinguishes this reciprocal mimesis from grounded mimesis is that the reciprocation actually produces a change in the person who is the subject of the mimesis. Indeed, participants are simultaneously subject and object in this kind of mimetic feedback system. So Daniel Stern, who was an infant psychologist, well, no, a psychologist of infants, he probably wasn't an infant psychologist anyway, in his analysis of mother-infant relations, shows one way in which this area of mimesis can be approached, observing the co-production of what he called vitality effects and their contribution of the development of an infant's identity. Other fields of research offer other analytical approaches, for example, evolutionary musicology and group improvisation, all take the reciprocal interaction between people as a key feature. And it should be noted that this direction of research, or this kind of focus, is in distinction to more traditional music analysis, which has a greater focus on those aspects of musical structure which are, quote, internal to the music. For example, in systems for organising pitch and rhythm, which I'll be talking about a bit at the end of this. By comparison, the term grounded mimesis focuses on the relationship between listener and sonic environment, and not on the interaction between the musicians themselves. The characteristic that distinguishes this kind of mimesis from reciprocal mimesis is that the environment or object represented is not itself materially changed by the process of representation. For example, listening to Hildegard Westerkamp's Kit's Beach Soundwalk or Luc Ferrari's Presque-Rien does not produce a reciprocal change in the beach, coastline or village recorded, at least not on the most direct and seemingly obvious level. As another example, when an improvising group uses electronic sounds generated from outside the circle of the musicians, for example location recordings, the process of inclusion of these other sounds into musical practice results in changes for the musicians and the musical culture, but not necessarily for the object represented. Much sound art makes use of these kinds of grounded mimesis, where the sources of the recording or synthesized sounds are not present and thus are not able to listen back. As with reciprocal mimesis, grounded mimesis is marginalized in more traditional forms of musicology, where, say in music, it's put in the subcategory of program music. So, like the Pastoral Symphony, something like that, that it represents the weather and things like that. So it's put in this subcategory of program music. However, the idea for me is not to fix a fundamental difference in the substance of these notions of mimesis, but to explore some of the ways in which this binary is opened out or deconstructed. And I'm going to offer two examples of how this relationship might be worked through in different ways. So one of them verges towards the schizophrenic, and the other towards a more idealistic fusion. So the schizophrenic version follows the disruptive effects of media technology on instruments and group music making, whilst the more idealistic version focuses on the connections between dancing and a sound walk. So first we go into the schizophrenic version. So Jean-Luc Nancy uses the example of a face, your face, to illustrate the way in which individual exposure plays an explicit part in being together. So my face, always exposed to others, always turned towards another and faced by him or her, never facing myself. This is the archy-original impossibility of Narcissus that opens straight away onto the possibility of the political. So, in terms of the sound making of a group, the performer's voice or instrument provides the acoustic face which might be turned to another, and through which an individual becomes present in the politics of being together. The audibility of a performer's gestures and the link between the gesture and sound is the starting point from which this reciprocal mimesis in sound making can occur. However, the faceless, in terms of the individual gendered performer, electronic voice of a synthesized sound or a recorded soundscape allows grounded mimesis to enter into sonic culture. By playing a recording, switching on a radio, or monitoring an internet site, one can be in the presence of sound sources which are not listening back and which are not participating in the here and now interchanges of the group. This creates a significant space for new conceptions of the instrument, mediating between the reciprocal voice of the musician and the voice of a technologically mediated other. This new kind of instrument may act as a bridge between grounded and reciprocal mimesis, moving between the musician's individualized voice and new forms of technologized presence. So I'm going to give an example of what this, an example of what an instrument like that might be, and just to give a bit more of a feeling of that. So I've been working with a particular conception of an electronic instrument called the Ouija board, which is used by two performers who work in a group alongside other acoustic musicians. The shadow of the Ouija player's hands acts as a control mechanism. So it's the shadow which operates things, not the actual physical hand itself. And the gaze of the performer is not only on the hands as they appear before them, connected to their body, but also at the shadow that the hands cast on the surface of the instruments. The shadow acts as a metaphor as well as a literal controller, since along with the visual representation of the hand as a shadow, it enables a different relationship with electronically mediated sound. Rather than thinking of the loudspeakers as simply another form of presence to be treated in a similar way to the sound making of a live musician, the sound is experienced like the shadow of the hand as a negative imprint left by the sounding object. The performer of the Ouija instrument becomes engaged in a form of mediumship, listening out for and finding new places for these ghosts of sound sources. The expanded context of this negative imprint can be further clarified by considering its relation to Sigmund Freud's conception of the shadow in his essay on mourning and melancholia. Describing a patient suffering from melancholia, he wrote, "The shadow of the object fell upon the ego, and the later could henceforth be judged by a special agency, as though it were an object, the forsaken object." Recorded sound can perpetuate the traces of the lost object, simulating in a mechanical way the shadow objects created by the sufferer of melancholia or schizophrenia. This new kind of sound is in a fine balance between melancholia and the preservation of corpses. Radio bodies are nobodies, said Gregory Whitehead. As Alan S. Weiss details in his book Breathless, the technical prosthesis provided by recorded sound is a potent agent in the shift from 19th century lyrical nostalgia to the schizophrenic, multi-centered sensibility of postmodern identity. That's a very long sentence. The schizophrenic experience of musical togetherness, i.e. being together with the undead, exemplifies one of the ways in which reciprocal mimesis and grounded mimesis encounter each other. It emphasises the place of media technology and the role mediatized sound plays in new forms of group music making and instrument design. The schizophrenic example will now be followed by a more idealistic one, which places less emphasis on the significance of electronic media as a link between reciprocal and grounded mimesis, and instead focuses on the way in which they allow connection to be made between dancing and a minuet, a dancing minuet and walking in the city. So, this idealistic conception. The dérive is an experimental form of walking which holds an emblematic position in the listening experience of contemporary sound art, allowing the extended act of moving through urban space to thread together diverse and potentially discordant listening experiences. The walker in this scenario is exploring a particular kind of grounded mimesis, allowing themselves to be changed by the atmospheres and geography that they encounter during the walk. The object of the walk does not lie in a particular destination, but in an appreciation of chance encounters, emphasising the liberty of movement, unimpeded by barricades, defying ghettos or social containment. The minuet can be said to hold a similar, though somewhat reversed position in relation to music of the early 18th century, in which the musical structure of the minuet allows the constrained space of the dance floor to become the site for extended explorations of social engagement, regulated through the flow and breaking of the minuet's musical time. Whilst free improvisation allows for the emergence of new kinds of reciprocal mimesis, the formalisation of structures in the minuet allows a greater integration with existing social practices, and thus a wider potential for participation and engagement. The staging of contact between genders, the nature of the participation of onlookers, and the manifestation of other socially sanctioned expressions of equality and hierarchy are brought into a particular performative realisation by the musical structure of the minuet. These do not represent every possible encounter, but allow particular and socially valued models of reciprocity to be enacted and explored. The difference between minuet and dérive can be seen as a question of displacement, and how this displacement is realised, contained or released within the conception of the work. The third beat of the minuet, for example, does not align with the biped gait of human walking and is symptomatic of further asymmetries. So, I'm conscious that time has moved very quickly, for me anyway, and I don't want to stress everyone too much by carrying on reading to the very end, the bitter end of my text. So I think I'll move to a conclusion which I'll perform live. So I think there's something important about our ability to move between grounded mimesis and this reflexive mimesis. So how we actually perform this kind of turn, how we can actually find ways of doing it, is valuable. It's a valuable thing to be able to realise in some way. And one obvious reason for this is because the fracture, if you like, between human activity and the environment is something that's changing the grounds that we actually live on. So this grounded area, this idea of there being a grounded thing on which we are basing a certain kind of mimesis, is not actually a stable and fixed entity. There is a relationship anyway between what we're doing as people and the consequences in the environment. So in some way, the difficulties of making these kind of turns is worth pursuing, because it's one of the ways in which one can begin to sense how our relations to each other are part of a participation with the environment, without simply saying something like that. The details of it are quite rich and hard to feel. So it could be a legitimate thing to say that in some way landscapes do have ears and they do listen back. So our notion of what an ear is or what listening is might be open to much wider interpretations, and this rather brutal separation of saying that the things that aren't human don't listen back maybe can be nuanced in some ways, but without losing sight of the value of our reciprocal relationships with each other. And I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. And the really interesting question of equality and hierarchy in musical measurements, I look forward to talking about another day. So, thank you very much.